The rhythm was constant, a hollow, metallic pinging that echoed through the small space. Rain hammered against the rusted tin sheets above, turning the shack into a drum of relentless noise. Leo sat on the floor, his eyes locked on the page, but his focus was fractured. A steady stream of water found a gap in the corroded metal, dripping with rhythmic precision. It hit the math textbook in his lap, soaking the corner of a complex equation. He shifted his weight, pulling the book away, but the ceiling offered no mercy. Another drop landed, then another, spreading a dark, damp stain across the paper. He wiped the moisture away with his thumb, the ink smearing under the pressure. He moved the book again, angling it to catch the light from a single flickering bulb. Yet the water followed. It pooled on the floorboards, creeping toward his feet. He did not look up. He did not curse the roof or the storm. He simply adjusted his position, shielding the text with his body, his movements precise and practiced. The shack groaned under the weight of the downpour. Leo set the damp book aside and crawled toward the center of the room. Sarah, Mia, and Sam were already there, pressed together in the corner. They shared a single, thin blanket, their movements synchronized to maximize the meager warmth. Their breath hung in the air, small clouds of mist. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but the silence felt heavy. In the eyes of those living in the houses with solid walls, they were just the trash pickers, kids. The label was a persistent, invisible weight. It arrived with the morning mail and lingered in the stares of passers-by. It followed them like a shadow. Sarah pulled the edge of the blanket tighter, tucking it around Sam's shoulders. Mia leaned her head against the wall, listening to the muffled sounds. They did not speak of the name they had been given. They simply existed as a unit, a small, impenetrable circle against the cold. The label was a fact of their environment, as undeniable as the holes in the roof. They sat in the dim light, 4 bodies huddled together. They knew the world saw them as something less, but within the confines of the blanket, they were everything to each other. The label was just a word. The office smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Leo stood at the counter, his hands gripping the edges of the scholarship application. He had spent weeks refining every sentence, checking the math, and ensuring the ink was dark and legible. The clerk did not look up from the screen. Leo slid the folder across the laminate surface, his heart pressing against his ribs. The clerk paused, glanced at the address on the form, and stopped. A sharp, dismissive exhale filled the space between them. The clerk did not read the text. He did not check the grades or the records. He simply folded the paper in half, a sharp, final sound, and tossed it into the waste bin beside the desk. The paper hit the bottom with a soft thud, settling among discarded coffee cups. The clerk muttered about wasted paper and returned to his typing. Leo stood frozen. The air in the room felt thin. He looked down at the bin. His work and his future were now indistinguishable from the trash. He felt the heat rise in his chest, but he did not speak. He simply watched the white edge of the paper peeking out from under a crumpled receipt. Leo waited until the clerk turned back to the screen. He reached down, his fingers brushing the rim of the metal bin. He pulled the application out, the paper slightly bent and marked by a smudge of dust. He did not look at the clerk. He did not offer a word of protest. He simply tucked the paper into his bag and walked out into the afternoon light. The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the sharp, cold air of the office. He found a desk in the back, pulled out a fresh stack of paper, and began the work. He copied the form by hand, his pen moving with slow, deliberate precision. Every letter was formed with care, every number checked twice against his notes. He spent hours in the silence of the stacks, surrounded by the smell of old paper. His hand cramped, but he did not stop. When he finished, he placed the new document into a clean envelope. He walked to the post office, slid it into the slot, watching it disappear. He turned around, his pace steady and his head held level. Sarah pushed the heavy market door open before the streetlights had fully dimmed. The air inside smelled of damp produce and floor cleaner. Her first shift began with the unloading of crates. She lifted them one by one, feeling the wood bite into her palms, stacking them in rows. By the time the sun climbed above the rooftops, she was already moving into her second shift. The customers arrived in a steady, demanding stream. She scanned items, bagged groceries, and wiped down the counters, her movements becoming a blur of repetition. Her back ached, a sharp, persistent heat. When the lunch rush peaked, she took the third shift, covering for a worker who had not arrived. She moved through the aisles, restocking shelves, her vision blurred at the edges, the fluorescent lights humming a low, steady drone. She paused for a second, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. She forced herself to stand upright, gripped the handle of the broom, and pushed forward. The floor needed to be spotless. Every crate needed to be level. She worked until the store went dark, her muscles trembling. She simply finished the final task, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the night. The final customer of the night leaned over the counter, eyes narrowing as he counted his change. He stopped, his finger tapping a gap on the wooden surface. "There is a coin missing," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the cooling units. Sarah looked down at the register, then back at the man. "I gave you exactly what was owed," she replied, her voice steady despite the fatigue in her chest. The man shook his head, his face reddening. "You kept it. I saw your hand move too fast." He gestured toward the shopkeeper, who emerged from the back office with a heavy, impatient stride. The shopkeeper did not ask for Sarah's side. He did not look at the ledger. He simply pointed at the register and then at the door. "Empty your pockets," he commanded. Sarah pulled her hands from her pockets, palms open, showing nothing but the calluses from the day's labor. The shopkeeper ignored the gesture. "I will not have thieves in this store," the shopkeeper stated, his tone final. He reached into the drawer, pulled out the ledger, and drew a thick, black line through the record. "You are docked for the week. Every cent. Leave now." The shopkeeper turned his back, leaving Sarah standing in the center of the aisle. The shopkeeper retreated into the back office, leaving Sarah in the dim light of the closing store. The silence was absolute. Her hands remained at her sides, palms flat against her thighs, the sting of the injustice sharp and cold. She could have shouted. Instead, she turned toward the supply closet, pulled out the heavy, damp mop, and began to work. She pushed the mop across the floor in long, steady strokes, the water leaving a clean, dark trail on the linoleum. She focused entirely on the friction of the bristles against the grime, the rhythmic slap of the mop head against the floorboards. When the floor shone, she rinsed the mop, wrung it out until her knuckles turned white, and hung it back on the hook. She walked out of the store, her pockets empty, her shoulders square. The night air was crisp, cooling the heat in her face. She walked home through the quiet streets, watching the way the pale moonlight hit the pavement, turning the cracked concrete into a path of silver. Mia placed the model on the center of the wooden desk. It was a structure built from thin wire and carefully measured scraps, a testament to weeks of labor. She stepped back, her hands clasped, watching the way the light caught the intricate joints. The classroom was quiet. Then the door swung open. 3 boys walked in, their footsteps heavy and uneven. They stopped at the desk, their eyes fixed on the model. One of them reached out, his fingers hovering over the delicate frame. Mia stepped forward, her palm raised in a silent plea to stop. The boy laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the walls. He shoved her aside, his shoulder catching her arm and sending her stumbling against the chalkboard. With a single, deliberate motion, he brought his fist down onto the center of the structure. The sound of snapping wire and splintering wood filled the room. The model collapsed, the intricate geometry reduced to a pile of twisted metal and jagged shards on the floor. The boys did not wait for a reaction. Mia remained by the chalkboard, her breath hitching in her chest. She knelt, her fingers hovering just inches above the debris, tracing the path of the destruction. Mia walked past the school gates, the weight of the day pressing into her shoulders. She did not head home. She turned toward the outskirts of the neighborhood, where the rusted fences of the junkyard marked the edge of the world. The gate groaned as she pushed it open, the sound lost in the wind. Inside, mountains of discarded metal and splintered timber rose into the night sky. She stepped over a pile of broken pipes, her boots crunching on glass. The air smelled of wet rust and damp earth. She stopped at the center of the yard, the darkness thick and suffocating. She knelt, her fingers probing the cold, jagged surfaces of the debris. She pulled aside a heavy sheet of corrugated metal, revealing a cache of copper wire and smooth, sturdy slats of pine. She tested the tension of the wire, pulling it taut between her hands. It held. She gathered the wood, stacking the pieces against her chest, feeling the grain and the weight of the potential hidden within the rot. She found a coil of thin, flexible steel, perfect for the joints she had envisioned. Each piece she touched was a victory over the day's ruin. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. Mia sat cross-legged, the salvaged wood and wire spread out before her like a puzzle. Her fingers moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, twisting the steel wire into tight, load-bearing knots. She slotted a piece of pine into place, but the frame shuddered and tilted. She held her breath, watching the balance point. It was too heavy on the left. She pulled a smaller, jagged piece of metal from her pile, wedging it into the base to act as a counterweight. The structure held. She worked for hours, ignoring the ache in her wrists and the cold seeping through the floorboards. She wove the wire through the wood, creating a web of support that was far more complex than her initial design. Every connection was a deliberate choice, a refusal to let the previous destruction dictate the outcome. As the sun climbed higher, the model took its final form, a soaring, geometric shape that caught the morning light. She placed the last wire brace, her hands trembling slightly from the effort. She stepped back, her breath hitching as she looked at the finished work. Sam stepped onto the schoolyard, the gravel crunching under his feet. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, walking with a steady, measured pace. He reached the center of the courtyard, but the path was blocked. 3 boys stood in a tight line, their gazes dropping to the ground. They saw the soles of his shoes, worn thin and held together by layers of tape. A sharp, high-pitched laugh cut through the morning air. Then, another. The sound rippled outward, drawing more students into the circle. Sam stopped. He felt the heat rising in his face, but he did not look up. He watched the way the dust kicked up around their sneakers, swirling in the wind. They pointed, their voices rising in a chorus of mockery that echoed off the brick walls. He tried to move to the left, but they shifted in unison, closing the gap. He was trapped in a ring of noise. He took a slow breath, his chest tight, and forced his muscles to relax. He did not shout back. He did not plead. He simply stood his ground, letting the laughter wash over him until it lost its sting. When a gap finally opened, he walked through it. He sat down, the concrete cold against his legs, and pulled his knees toward his chest, the silence of the corner providing a sudden, sharp relief from the noise. Sam pulled the laptop from his bag, the plastic casing cracked and held together by a single strip of tape. He pressed the power button, his thumb hovering over the key until the screen flickered to life with a low, rhythmic hum. A red icon blinked in the corner, signaling the battery was near empty. He had minutes, perhaps less. He opened the command line, his fingers flying across the keys with a speed that belied the machine's age. The cursor pulsed, a steady heartbeat against the dark background. He typed a string of logic, his eyes locked on the lines of text scrolling upward. The screen dimmed suddenly, the power failing. He tapped the spacebar, his breath held tight, and the light surged back, brighter than before. He ignored the cold air and the distant sounds of the street, his entire world narrowing down to the glow of the monitor. He finished the final line and hit enter. A small window appeared, confirming the code had compiled without error. He sat back, the weight of the laptop resting on his knees, and watched the lines of his own creation run in a perfect, unbroken loop. The kitchen table was a slab of warped plywood, scarred by years of use. Leo pushed it into the center of the room, the legs scraping against the uneven floorboards. Sarah, Mia, and Sam pulled up their chairs, the wood groaning under their weight. In the center sat a single bowl of rice, the steam rising in thin, wispy ribbons. Leo divided the portion into 4 equal piles, his movements precise and steady. They sat in the dimming light, the silence of the house broken only by the soft clink of spoons. A sudden gust of wind rattled the walls, sending a spray of dust down from the ceiling. They looked up, their eyes tracking a jagged hole in the tin roof. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, shifting into deep indigo. A cluster of clouds drifted past the opening, their edges glowing with the last remnants of the sun. Mia pointed, her finger tracing a shape that looked like a jagged mountain range. Sam laughed, a sharp, genuine sound that echoed off the damp walls. They leaned in, shoulders brushing, their focus shifting from the hunger in their stomachs to the vast, changing canvas above them. The rice was gone in minutes, but the laughter remained. They sat there for a long time, watching the clouds morph and dissolve, finding a strange, quiet victory. Leo stacked the empty bowls, the ceramic clinking softly in the quiet room. Outside, a heavy boot kicked the siding of the shack, a sharp reminder of the world that labeled them. Sarah reached out, her hand steady as she took the stack from him, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle rather than the door. They did not look at the wall where the sound had come from. Instead, Leo pulled a tattered textbook from under the table, the spine held together by layers of tape. He opened it to a page filled with complex equations, the ink faded, but the logic clear. Mia leaned in, tracing the diagrams with her finger, her mind already calculating the structural integrity of the bridges she would one day build. Sam joined them, describing the architecture of a program he was designing, his voice low and rhythmic. They spoke of the books they had scavenged from the library bins, dissecting the themes and the science within. When the wind howled through the gaps in the wall, they simply raised their voices to match it, drowning out the cold with the intensity of their ideas. They did not trade stories of the people who had mocked them or the shopkeepers who had stolen their pay. Those names were never spoken. They replaced the bitterness of the day with the weight of their own potential. Every sentence was a brick in a foundation they were building for themselves, a wall of intellect and ambition that no insult could penetrate. They sat in the dim light, four minds weaving a future that existed entirely within their own resolve. The seasons bled into one another, marked only by the changing temperature of the floorboards under their feet. Winter frost gave way to the humid, suffocating heat of summer, but the routine remained a constant, grinding pulse. Leo spent his days hauling heavy timber, his palms thickening into rough, leather-like pads that could grip wet steel without slipping. Sarah moved through the hospital wards at night, her fingers developing a steady, clinical precision that never faltered, even when her muscles screamed for rest. Mia spent hours in the junkyard, her hands stained permanently with grease and iron filings, her nails worn down from prying apart rusted joints and salvaged wires. Sam sat hunched over the flickering screen of his salvaged laptop, his fingertips calloused from the repetitive, frantic typing that defined his nights. They grew taller, their frames hardening under the weight of their own ambition. The shack remained the same, but the people inside were being forged into something durable. They did not notice the passage of time as a linear progression, but as a series of physical changes, a deeper voice, a broader shoulder, a more permanent scar. Every drop of sweat that hit the floor was a tally mark against the poverty that tried to define them. By the time the years began to blur, their hands were the tools of architects, engineers, and healers. The final months arrived with a crushing, relentless weight. Sleep became a luxury they could no longer afford, traded for extra hours of study and deeper shifts at work. Leo stood over his drafting table, his eyes burning from the harsh glare of a single bulb, his hands trembling as he traced the final lines of his thesis. He gripped the edge of the wood until his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to let his head drop to the surface. Sarah returned from the clinic, her feet swollen and her mind fogged by a double shift. Yet she immediately began organizing the notes for their final exams. Mia sat on the floor, surrounded by piles of discarded blueprints, her fingers moving with a frantic, precise rhythm that defied her exhaustion. Sam kept the laptop running, his face illuminated by the steady, cold glow of lines of code that refused to compile. The air in the shack grew thin, heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of their own fatigue. When Leo's pen snapped under the pressure of his grip, the sound echoed like a gunshot. In the small space, he didn't curse. He simply reached for another, his movements mechanical and sharp. They were no longer just surviving the day. They were sprinting toward a horizon, they had spent a decade mapping. Every breath was a conscious effort to keep moving. Every heartbeat a drum keeping time for the final, desperate push. They were exhausted, broken, and nearing the end of their endurance, but they did not stop. The silence that followed the final keystroke was heavier than the noise that preceded it. Sam closed the laptop lid, the click sounding final in the small room. Across the table, the pens were capped, the blueprints rolled, and the textbooks stacked in neat, precise towers. The air in the shack seemed to change, losing its sharp edge of urgency and settling into a strange, expectant stillness. Leo stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the window. He looked out at the street where they had once been dismissed as shadows, but now the world outside felt different. It was no longer a place to hide from, but a space waiting for their arrival. Sarah leaned back against the wall, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the plaster, seeing them not as flaws, but as the boundaries of a life they were about to leave behind. Mia and Sam joined them, the four of them standing in a line, their breathing synchronized in the quiet. They did not speak. There was nothing left to explain. The hunger, the cold, and the relentless grind had been replaced by a singular, vibrating tension. They were ready. The morning was finally arriving. The hall was filled with the low hum of 1,000 voices, a sound that felt alien compared to the silence of their shack. Leo stood in the staging area, his palms pressed against the rough fabric of his pockets. He looked down at his hands. The skin was thick, marked by deep lines and hardened by years of hauling stone and mixing mortar. A student beside him glanced at those hands, then looked away. But Leo did not flinch. He was not here to blend in. When his name was called, the sound was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise. He stepped forward, his boots heavy and steady. The stage lights were blinding, washing out the faces in the crowd, but he kept his eyes fixed on the center point. He reached out as the official extended the leather-bound folder. Their fingers met. The paper was smooth, cool, and impossibly light. He held the folder high, a physical weight that balanced years of rejection. He turned, walked off the stage, and felt the floor hold firm. Sarah left the market floor for the last time, the smell of produce replaced by the sterile, sharp scent of antiseptic. Her nights had once been spent scrubbing grime from tiles, but now they were spent monitoring the steady pulse of monitors. She walked the long, linoleum-floored corridors, her stride measured and silent. In a quiet room, she stopped beside a patient who stared at the ceiling with the same hollow look she had worn years ago. Sarah reached out, her fingers finding the patient's wrist, to check the pulse. The skin was thin, the grip weak, and in that contact, the years of cleaning floors felt like a distant, fading echo. She adjusted the IV drip, her movements precise and practiced. She had spent a lifetime being told she was invisible, but here, her presence mattered. When the sun began to bleed through the blinds, she finished her final shift. She walked out of the hospital, the heavy market keys gone. She had traded the broom for the stethoscope. Her hands, once raw from scrubbing, were now steady, capable, and ready to mend. Mia stood before the drafting table, the fluorescent light casting a sharp grid over her blueprints. Years ago, her hands had been raw and bleeding from twisting rusted wire and jagged wood scraps into models that the wind could knock over. Now, those same hands moved with practiced precision across a digital interface, calculating load-bearing stress for a skyscraper. A colleague pointed to a section of the design, questioning the structural integrity of the cantilever. Mia leaned in, her eyes scanning the geometry. She saw the weakness instantly, a flaw that reminded her of the hollow center in her childhood home. She did not hesitate. She deleted the line, redrew the support, and reinforced the foundation with a single, decisive stroke. The tension in the room dissipated as the simulation stabilized. She had learned long ago that a structure was only as strong as its weakest connection, and she had spent a lifetime reinforcing hers. She walked to the window of the studio, looking out at the city skyline. She traced the lines of the buildings with her finger, seeing the hidden skeletons of steel. Sam sat before a bank of monitors that hummed with the steady, cool air of a server room. Years ago, his fingers had danced across the keys of a discarded laptop that flickered and died if he moved it too quickly. Now, his hands moved with fluid speed across a mechanical keyboard, his eyes tracking lines of code that scrolled like a waterfall of light. A red alert flashed on the main terminal, signaling a system-wide breach in the network security. The room went silent as his team watched the progress bar stall. Sam did not panic. He leaned into the glow, his mind tracing the logic of the error back to its source, just as he had once traced the frayed wires of his old machine. He found the loop, a hidden vulnerability that threatened to collapse the entire architecture. With a single, sharp command, he rewrote the protocol, sealing the breach and stabilizing the flow of data. The red light faded to a steady, rhythmic green. He leaned back, the screen reflecting in his eyes. He was no longer trying to keep a dying device alive. He was ensuring that the world stayed connected, his work a quiet, powerful pulse running through the heart of the digital age. The auditorium lights hit the polished wooden floor, creating a blinding glare that obscured the faces in the front rows. Leo, Sarah, Mia, and Sam stood in the wings, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and anticipation. They could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the same voices that had once whispered about their poverty, now hushed in expectation. Leo stepped forward, his boots making a sharp, rhythmic sound against the stage boards. He did not look at the people who had once turned him away. He felt the presence of his siblings flanking him, a solid, unmoving line of support. They moved in unison, their pace steady, their chins held high. The crowd was a blur of movement and sound, but they remained anchored to each other. They ignored the shifting shadows of their past detractors. They reached the center of the stage, the spotlight washing over them. But their eyes remained fixed on the horizon, searching for the only people whose approval had ever mattered. The silence in the room deepened as they stopped, standing together, ready to find the faces that had made this moment possible. The siblings stood at the edge of the stage, the light reflecting off the floorboards and into the vast, shadowed expanse of the auditorium. They ignored the applause that rippled through the front rows like a wave. Their eyes moved past the faces of those who had once mocked them, searching the periphery, the dim corners where the light failed to reach. Then they saw them. In the very last row, tucked against the back wall, sat their parents. The siblings stopped. The noise of the crowd seemed to drop away, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of their own hearts. Their parents did not stand or wave. They remained still, hands resting on their knees, fingers gnarled and steady. The siblings focused on those hands, the hands that had worked the soil, the hands that had held them through the coldest nights in the shack. The parents looked back, their faces etched with the lines of decades of labor, but their eyes were clear, burning with a fierce, overwhelming pride that bridged the distance between the stage and the back wall. It was a silent conversation, a recognition of every sacrifice made in the dark. The keys turned in the lock with a solid, heavy click. Leo pushed the door open, and the siblings stepped into the hallway of their own home. The air inside was still and dry, a sharp contrast to the damp, shifting atmosphere of the shack they had once called home. They walked through the rooms, their footsteps echoing on hardwood that did not groan or give way under their weight. That night, the storm broke over the city, a relentless downpour that rattled the windows. In the old days, this would have been the moment of panic. Instead, they stood in the living room, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. It was a rhythmic, steady sound, muffled and contained. Leo looked up at the ceiling, watching for the telltale dark spots that never appeared. The water stayed outside. The walls held firm. They moved from room to room, touching the solid plaster and the tight seals of the window frames. There was no drip, no puddle, no smell of mold. The era of the leaking roof had ended. For the first time, the rain was just weather, not a threat to their survival. The kitchen table was no longer a makeshift surface for study or a place to huddle for warmth. It was a solid, heavy slab of oak, polished and waiting. Leo carried the first platter from the stove, the steam rising in thick, fragrant curls that filled the room. Sarah followed with bowls of fresh vegetables, their colors vibrant against the dark wood. Mia and Sam brought the final dishes, the weight of the ceramic plates grounding their hands. They moved with a deliberate, quiet grace, placing each item with precision. There was no rush, no frantic need to divide portions before they vanished. They stood back for a moment, looking at the spread. It was a feast of abundance, a stark, undeniable reality that replaced the memory of the single bowl of rice they had once shared. The air in the room felt different. heavy with the scent of roasted herbs and warm bread. They did not speak, but the silence was no longer born of hunger or fear. They pulled the chairs out, the wood scraping softly against the floor. The table was full, and for the first time, the hunger was gone. Tonight, the table was their victory. The siblings sat, but the food remained untouched. Leo leaned forward, his gaze drifting from the steam rising off the plates to the hands resting on the table. They were his parents' hands. He saw the deep, permanent creases etched into the knuckles, the skin mapped with the history of decades of labor. These were the hands that had scrubbed floors until they bled, that had held the thin blankets tight against the cold, and that had pushed the siblings toward a future. Sarah reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from her mother's wrist. She saw the calluses, the slight tremors from years of exhaustion. Mia and Sam followed her gaze, the silence in the room thickening with sudden, sharp clarity. Every scar on those hands was a testament to a meal skipped. They had spent their lives looking forward, focused on their own climb, but now, the reality of the foundation beneath them became undeniable. The siblings looked at each other, then back at the hands that had carried them through the dark. The weight of it settled over the table, a profound realization that their victory was not just their own, but a gift bought with the very life force of the two people sitting before them. The silence in the room deepened, no longer heavy with the weight of the past, but filled with the quiet resonance of the present. Leo did not look up. He watched the way his father's thumb rested against the edge of the plate, a steady, rhythmic pressure that spoke of years of endurance. Sarah mirrored his stillness, her own hands folded neatly in her lap, mirroring the posture of the person who had once held her through the coldest nights. There was no need for grand declarations or tearful speeches. The air held them all in a soft, shared suspension. Mia watched the light catch the fine lines around her mother's eyes, noting the way they crinkled even in repose, a map of every worry she had ever carried. Sam, the youngest, leaned back, his eyes moving from one sibling to the next. They were all there, all present, all anchored by the same silent understanding. They were not just a family gathered for a meal. They were a testament to a long, arduous journey that had finally reached a place of rest. In this small, warm space, the only thing that existed was the profound, wordless connection between them. Leo finally looked up, meeting the eyes of his siblings one by one. There was no trace of the old fear or the shadow of the neighborhood labels. They had taken the dust of the junkyard, the cold of the winter nights, and the sting of every rejection, and used it as the mortar for the life they now held. Sarah reached out, placing her hand over her father's, her touch firm and steady. The poverty that had once threatened to erase them had instead become the bedrock of their character. They had not fought the world with anger. They had moved through it with a quiet, relentless kindness that had proven more durable than any obstacle. Mia and Sam joined the circle, their hands resting together in the center of the table. The history of their struggle was etched into the very air of the room, but it no longer held a sting. It was a foundation, a platform, a starting point for everything that was yet to come. They had turned the scarcity of their youth into a legacy of abundance, not of things, but of the bond they had forged in the dark. As the light shifted across the floor, they sat in the absolute certainty of their victory. The journey was complete.